A behavioral interview is when they ask you those rather awkward questions about your past professional experiences or your school projects if you're a recent graduate, for them to be able to predict your performance on the job. Now, why would they do this? Well, the simple answer is because this is the method that works best nowadays in high-performing companies. And the simple reason for this to be so efficient is because these companies have developed a core set of mission, vision, and core principles that they understand very well the types of people who will do well there. So remains to screen and find those people with those specific behaviors. Now, an important disambiguation here is if I tell you right now that I connect very much with your core mission and vision, that basically means nothing for a behavioral interview, right? So it's a very big difference between being agreeable to something and actually being good at those behaviors. And this is why these behavioral interviews can get slightly uncomfortable. Now, also important to understand is these behavioral interviews are actually scored. So in each question, there's a behaviorally anchored rating scale, if you want, from bad to great answers. And basically, these questions would be asked, same questions in the same order for each and every candidate. And some companies go as far as to even ask the same follow-up questions as well. Also, maybe useful to know is that each interviewer is supposed to take a ton of notes for them to be able to share these notes with the hiring team. And also for the telephone screening rounds, they are supposed to give you a pass or no pass immediately after, as you would expect. And for the virtual on-site interviews, also they are supposed to give you a hire or no hire recommendation after each round. So you should know how the process really works. Now, last but not least, where does this come from? In my experience, this comes from investment banking. At least that's where I heard it to be used the most in the past. But it's gradually taking over more and more markets because the level of skill of the workforce is to such a degree where behaviors seem to be extremely valuable nowadays. The STAR method is basically a template that employers came up with to better screen candidates, and of course for you to better structure your answers in a job interview, because as I mentioned in my previous episode, that these answers will actually get scored. Now, obviously, the STAR comes from situation, task, action, results, and there are a couple of other variations of these methods, such as the SOAR, O coming from the obstacle, or the SAR, to which they eliminated the task because it's not as important, or the PAR, where the situation and task is replaced by the problem statement. And not to forget the DAN method to answer behavioral. Now, how important is this template, this STAR template? Well, I believe it's super important, especially for junior to mid-level roles, because if you structure your answers, chances are you'll be much better understood by your interviewer and therefore better scored, right? Assuming you have a great performance. The only question mark is for super senior roles, where the idea is that as soon as you template your answers, you're not going to have such a natural performance during an interview, such as if I scripted my performance right now, it might not have come across as natural, right? So if I'd be reading this from a prompter. So this would be the only thing you should be aware of. But as a general idea, I would definitely recommend you to follow a template, primarily because you could focus your performance on scoring as many points as possible within a behavioral interview. The best way to prepare a behavioral interview, and pretty much any interview for that matter, is to have stories that you would like highlighted throughout that conversation. And of course, the best place to look for the highlights is in your CV, because that's where the most interesting stuff should be. Now, of course, it's a common challenge for people getting starting with this, not to be able to find enough stories. And one trick here is to zoom in and zoom out of some of those highlights in your career. Also, a very useful advice to help you to brainstorm for the types of stories that you're looking for is to understand the behaviors that these employers could be screening you on in that job interview. And for this, a useful area to consider is Amazon's 14 leadership principles, because they are the most advanced with these things. So try to find stories that would emulate each of these principles. Maybe, if you're applying for a junior role, you're not interested in hiring people or necessarily interested in frugality. But the idea of brainstorming stories related to behaviors is something I found very efficient. And from experience here, after coaching a few hundred people and talking to many more, I found this one quote to be particularly relevant when it comes to brainstorming for stories for job interviews. Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and work. So a little bit of advice when it comes to finding the best stories. And the first one, a very important one based on, again, my experience, is that it's likely that your first story on a given behavior will not be the best story on that behavior. So always keep in mind, be open-minded in the process, and think of on whether you can find an even better story to communicate that specific behavior. And this is often the case in failure stories. Also, another scenario is that when you communicate an idea in one way, and the better you get at behavioral interviewing, you find out that that idea can be much better communicated in a different way. The second pointer you want to keep in mind is you must give context for the situation that you're talking about. How important was the project, or was it just a test? If you do not focus on the situation, making it clear what was the project about and what was your role in the project, your interviewer will only be able to make a guess on this, and that's not really to your advantage. The third idea here is make information quantifiable, if at all possible. Don't just say it was a successful outcome. Try to quantify it, if it would be for the results part of the STAR answer. But quantifiable information sells well because it gives much better context to your interviewer to be able to evaluate you on that specific story. Next advice here, stay away from hypothetical situations. Don't talk about what would you do if you would have to deal with a certain situation. Talk about a past experience that you had, because that's, the definition of behavioral interviewing. They want to look at your past behaviors in order to predict your future performance on the job. And if you think about it, the hypothetical story cannot actually fit into a STAR answer. You cannot really have a result unless it's a hypothetical result, right? Next advice here, focus on the results. Results is something that people that are getting started with behavioral interviewing forget to talk about, because they get lost in the details of the action of their story. So when you prepare your stories, it is good advice to keep in mind the STAR method and to ensure that you would talk about each and every element of that STAR method. Number 6 here, ensure that you were the main actor in the project that you're talking about. Because if you only had a secondary role in a project that failed, probably you cannot really own that failure, and that will never be perceived as a strong answer in a job interview. So similarly, for whatever answer you give, try to ensure that you were the main actor in that given story, because this is one of the more standard follow-up questions in a job interview. And finally, ensure that your answer was not 20 years ago or was not too old. And this primarily happens with people that haven't been interviewing in a while or at all in the past 15 years. Try to ensure that your example is relatively recent, because if you think about it, the more recent the example, the more relevant the behavior will be for you to be able to get evaluated on your behaviors. Of course, if it's something that happened 20 years ago, but it was a turning point in your career, and to this day you feel like it's a relevant piece of information about yourself, and it can be used to evaluate your behavior, then yes, definitely use that. But more often than not, the more recent stories from your career would always be perceived better in a behavioral interview. Another particularly efficient method to prepare for a behavioral interview, if done correctly, is to go through lists of most commonly asked questions. Now, what do I mean about done correctly? I mean, first you should brainstorm for the stories, if you remember my previous video, and only then, once you have your stories ready, to try to A/B test those stories on these most commonly asked questions. So next I'm going to present you with 8 categories of such questions that you're likely going to get asked during your job interview. And the first category is working with data. For example, tell me about the time when you use data to develop a strategy. The second category here is your ability to deliver. Tell me about the time when you were 75% of a project and had to pivot strategy to ensure its successful completion. Or describe a long-term project that you managed and how did you keep everything moving along in a timely manner. The third category here is clarity of thought. Tell me about the time when you came up with a new approach to a problem. Or tell me about an ambiguous situation that you had to deal with recently, preferably. Next one, inventiveness. What is the most innovative idea that you had in the past 6 months or 1 year, for example? Failure stories. Tell me about the time when you failed. Or what is your greatest professional regret? Next one is about interpersonal skills, trust, and leadership in general. Tell me about the time when you had to apologize to someone. Notice here, to apologize, earn trust. Notice the link here. What did you do when you need to motivate a group of individuals? You must have earned their trust. Again, tell me about the time when you received negative feedback from your manager. How did you respond? I'll let you guess on this one as well. Give me an example of when you saw peers struggling and decided to step in and help. Describe a situation where you negotiated with others in your organization to reach an agreement, right? So this is a larger category, but definitely a very important one in a behavioral interview in particular. Next one, customers, working with customers. And of course, it only makes sense if you are supposed to work with customers in your role. Tell me about time when you had to deal with a difficult customer, or how do you develop client relationships? Of course, again, this is more like for sales roles. How do you develop client relationships, of course. And last, but the most important questions you're likely gonna get asked in your behavioral interview is the general types of questions. What is the project that you're the most proud of? This could be an opening as well. This would be you'd very much be to your advantage if they open this way. Or what's your strength and weakness? This is also a very important, especially your strength to decide something for your interview. The weakness will be touched upon in a future video as well. Why do you want to work here? Why do you want to work for this company? A very common question in job interviews. And finally, the most commonly asked question, and it's not unheard of to get asked this at the beginning of each of your rounds, be it a telephone screen or virtual interviews. Tell me about yourself. So tell me about yourself is, of course, the topic of a future video. I also touched it in other videos if you want to see examples, but it's one that you're likely going to get asked, and basically the most asked and the most worthwhile to prepare for any job interview. So this method is definitely not for everyone, and especially if you're a sensitive person, I would rather skip on this preparation method. But I found it particularly efficient for people that want to quickly ramp up their behavioral interviewing performance to start talking about failure stories. Why is this? Well, simply because they are the most challenging, one of the more challenging topics to talk about in these behavioral interviews. And I know from experience they are they have a very interesting learning curve, if you want. Now, a failure story, just quickly, must also follow, the STAR format, and the situation, task, and action should be straightforward to understand, but the results should actually be your learnings from that failure story, and, of course, in a quantifiable format. Moreover, a failure story should be communicated like 50% of the time should be spent on the situation, task, and action, and the other 50% on the learnings, right? On another note, an interviewer is mainly looking for two things in a failure story. They want you to be truthful to them, and the second one, they want to see what you learned from that story. That's why you'd want to allocate all that much time. Now, I know from experience, people that are getting started with behavioral interviewing will need around 3 failure stories to find the first best failure story. So if you already have a great failure story that you're confident talking about, most likely you're not a beginner in behavioral interviewing. So congratulations. Here, but the idea is that if you want a quick method to ramp up your performance in these behavioral interviews, these failure stories seem to be a great way to start. Another question that many of you who are getting started with behavioral interviews ask me is, what if I don't have an answer to their question? What can I do in this case? And from experience here, I can tell you that this is the wrong question to ask, because in in a behavioral interview, the problem is not whether you'll have an answer, but whether you'll have the best answer in that job interview. And to explain you a little bit further here, these behavioral questions are designed in such a way that anyone applying for that role should have an answer for them. And I can tell you from hundreds of feedbacks from both successful and unsuccessful candidates that this does not show as a concern in a behavioral interview primarily. Of course, it's a completely different matter for the technical part. If you have one for your interview, if you don't have an answer, that's a rather different topic. But in a behavioral interview, the problem is always whether you have the best story to talk about when getting asked that question. And on the same topic here, another common problem in job interviews is that they ask you different questions for which you'd like to use the same story, and you'll know that repeating the same story is probably not a good idea. And this is another sign of you not having enough stories, or you not knowing how to spin the same story, not to sound as if it's exactly the same clone of the one you just gave. So all in all, the problem in job interviews for the behavioral part is not whether you have an answer, but whether you have the best possible answer to the question that you're getting asked. The question of how long should your answers be is a quite popular topic in the behavioral interviewing community. And I can tell you from the start, the correct answer to this question is make sense. And the detailed version of this answer is that whatever number of minutes you'll hear from anyone, including myself, it will only be because we want you to do well while training yourself for the actual interview. So in other words, if I tell you that you must stick to 2 minutes per answer in a job interview, and this very much applies particularly to sales roles and senior sales roles, then it's primarily because I want you to be more concise. I want you to use less words, because to me it looks like you can definitely communicate something more concisely. I've also heard of advice for job interviews from the companies themselves for you to take 10 minutes to talk about something, and this is primarily because they would want to encourage you to talk as much as possible in a job interview. I found both these pieces of advice, both the 2 minutes and 10 minutes, very misleading for the actual performance that you'll have during the interview. In a job interview, you must, in my opinion, self-assess and make sense. It will be very different, not only to how well you'll perform that day and how much you prepared in advance, but also to the interviewer, to the person that you're talking to. What if that person asks you to, okay, go on, please develop on this more? What if they prefer 10 minutes answer, whereas you prefer 2 minutes answer? You cannot stick with those 2 minutes. You must go to at great length to satisfy your interviewer's request to have lengthier answers. So, long story short, the length of your answers is dictated by your performance during that interview and by your interviewer themselves. Everything else, with the number of minutes or the recommendations, is just for training purposes. So how long does it take you to become good at behavioral interviewing? Well, from experience, it might take you anywhere from 1 day to 7 months in my experience. And I believe the correct answer to your question is self-assess. So once you become good at understanding the quality of your answers, that's when you will know exactly how much time you need to prepare for that interview. Most of the time, you'll actually be constrained by an interview date, so you'll know how much time you have to prepare for that interview, and you'll plan accordingly against that. But as a general rule, the best behavior that I found preparing for these interviews is to self-assess and to become good at self-assessing. Now, speaking this, including for very senior HR roles, so people who do interviewing for a living, them too need to become good at understanding, hey, where's the bar? The behavioral interviewing bar for the interview that I'm preparing for. And you could simply go online, try to compare various sources for examples of answers and compare them to yours and see where you stand against these benchmarks. And once you become good at benchmarking yourself, that's when you know how much time you'll need to become good at behavioral interviewing. So finding your best weakness can be quite a time-consuming process preparing for these job interviews. And of course, if you need some inspiration, there you go, a couple of reference points. Now, if I want to give you more advice here, what would it be? At first, in my opinion, you should stay away from the generic ones, from the public speaking type of weaknesses. Always spend time to find what's the best weakness for you, and that's something that must be representative of yourself. For security purpose, if you want, try to pick also a backup weakness in case they're not happy with the first one. What works in these job interviews with these weaknesses is not necessarily the weakness that you pick, but how you sell it. So prepare your pitch on your weakness, and this is, in my experience, the key to selling your weakness in a behavioral interview. So what is the best strategy to prepare going into a behavioral interview? And to explain to you this, let me first give you a bad approach to prepare for this interview. So the standard and the wrong approach, in my opinion, is you'll usually know when your interview is set, usually in 2 or 3 weeks. And for this, you'll say, hey, I'll spend half of this time to prepare my stories and the other half of this time to actually roleplay with someone and to practice. When in fact this approach is a bit static, because what happens is you don't really know how good your stories are until you roleplay them with someone. And if you don't know how good they are, if you spend 1 week or 2 weeks on something, you don't know if it's good or bad. In my opinion, is not the optimal employment of your time. So that's why my recommendation to you would be to quickly come up with the first version of your 20 stories, for example. And once you have those 20 stories, quickly roleplay them with someone. For example, you could spend 3 or 4 days to come up with those 20 stories, and then 3 or 4 days to roleplay them with someone, which probably that person will not be, as so quickly available, so readily available for you to practice with. And once you've done this loop, try to do it one more time, and you'll see that the second version of your stories will actually be significantly better than the first. And if you loop through the process, and of course you document yourself through the process and see what others do to improve their stories, that's what I found to work best in significantly improving the quality of your performance in a behavioral interview. So tell me about yourself is not a behavioral question, primarily at least. So then why would I include it in this mini series? The primary reason for this is because it's a so commonly asked question, and basically the starting point of many of interview conversations, that you cannot really skip it. And the second reason for including it is because you could actually go with a slightly behavioral answer to such a question. But with the basics first, what is a great answer for tell me about yourself? A great answer to tell me about yourself is a motivational one. A motivational answer, is a different answer from candidate to candidate. And the two main types of answers I found through time is, the first one is the more structured approach, which is favored by, let's say, 90% of the candidates. And the second one is the when you go off script and off format with a fully motivational answer. This does not happen often, and it's certainly not for beginners. But if you manage to get to that level, that's where the best answers are. Now, for the structured version of your Tell Me About Yourself, that's usually going to include 3 parts. The first part is a brief description of you're a motivated individual with 15 years of experience on the job, followed by some of the key highlights from your career that you could also take from your CV. And here is where you can take the behavioral approach to answering this question. When you highlight those main experience from your CV, you could easily go with them in a star format. So if you want to take 2 examples, you can take with 2-star answers within the Tell Me About Yourself. And of course, last, you must add a closing note here, which will vary, from candidate to candidate. You could even talk about extracurricular activities if you wanted to. As I said in one of my previous videos, the length of your answer is basically decided by yourself, by your performance during the interview, and by your interviewer's expectations during that actual encounter. So these would be some of the main pointers that you would want to keep in mind preparing your answer for Tell Me About Yourself. Why do you want to work for this company is another non-behavioral question, but one that's also important to prepare for going into a job interview, simply because it's very likely to pop up during your encounters. And as with the tell me about yourself, the best answers will always be motivational ones. But if I had to give you a little bit of structure here, I'd ensure that I touch upon these 3 points. First, I wanted to compliment the company in any way, because after all, you're interviewing for a job there. The second one is what's your differentiator going into a job interview? What's that one thing that sets you apart from other job interview candidates, right? And the third one would be what's in for you from this role. And the best candidates always, know very well what's in for them going into a job interview, or applying for these opportunities. Again, I will tell you that the best possible answers are a combination of these 3 factors, but I found it as a useful advice and efficient advice to follow this template. So just quickly, what are the 10 most common mistakes in these job interviews? The first one is weak rapport with your interviewer, and the most common mistake here is to open up the conversation with "Hi." I'll leave a link in the video description if you want to learn more about how do you build that rapport. The second mistake I want to touch upon here is rather ambiguous or generic types of answers or weak stories in general. And here, to help you a little bit, it's no problem if you don't have an answer, your best story on the spot to a behavioral question. You could go eventually hypothetical for a couple of seconds or for even 30 seconds if you want, but then ultimately your goal is to talk about a specific encounter, the STAR method with a given result that can be scored ultimately. The third mistake that happens in these job interviews is that because of the stress or because of the connection problem, you don't understand the question you're getting asked. And some of you are too shy to ask for clarifications and basically answer the wrong question. So this is also something you'd want to really avoid, especially nowadays when these interviews are completely digital online. The next one is some of you do not prepare enough stories and you have a tendency to repeat those stories over and over again. You should be aware that especially high-performing companies are very good at indexing information and keeping track of your answers during a job interview. So unless you really know what you're doing, you should stay away from repeating the same stories over and over again. The next mistake I want to touch upon here is a rather beginner type of mistake when you forget to talk about the results in your behavioral answer. So during the heat of the moment, you try to explain as good as possible the situation, and then you forget to talk about the results. Like in most cases, they will ask you in a follow-up, okay, what was the outcome of that situation? But as a general rule of thumb, never forget the results of your STAR answer. Next one, in behavioral answers, people have a tendency to omit key information, key metrics, quantifiable information. So that's why you want to ensure you have numbers in your answers. You have to make the most sense, the most possible sense with your STAR answers. Number 7 here, negativism. So negativism is something that usually happens with candidates that are not going through this for the first time. So usually applies for people who, it's not because they don't know what's interviewing, but because of the performance is rather poor and the energy level is so low during that interview that they always have a tendency to end on a negative note, on a boring note. So always have a tendency to finish on a high and to show energy, enthusiasm. This is a behavior that really sells in job interviews. Of course, with the obvious remark not to exaggerate here by any means. Next one, number 8, too long or too short stories. Again, I made another video on this, but the length of your answer should be determined by your performance during the job interview. However long you feel comfortable speaking out your answer and how long you feel like your interviewer accepts your answers to be. So you should always, read the room and listen carefully. Number 9 here, you block or you feel too comfortable in the job interview. So understand behavioral interviewing is by design slightly uncomfortable. So unless if I'd be interviewing you, I'd have to get you either too comfortable, either slightly uncomfortable, to really understand better how you behave, about your behavior, or how you behave under pressure, if you want. So there are these two extremes. Some interviewers, the best interviewers I know, will make you feel so comfortable that you'll give them all the information, even the information you would have never dreamed of giving them. Another approach, the opposite, is to make you uncomfortable, to give you impossible questions and to see how you react. So always, try to make sense. This is the best advice I can give you here. And last but not least, you have a poor list of questions for them, for your interviewer. And this is something you can never omit preparing for a behavioral interview. And here are a couple of examples. So how do people cheat in behavioral interviews? Well, they actually cheat in three ways. The first one would be the cheat sheet. And the most basic cheat sheet you can prepare is with a list of stories, not to get lost during that interview. And it's actually quite universally accepted by all the interviewers I know, at least. The most advanced way of a cheat sheet is to actually have your answers literally behind your camera and read your answers out loud like you would from a teleprompter. Like, this is how, if you watch TV, this is how news gets sent to you every day, basically. Now, truth be said, those people prepare for years to become good at reading from a teleprompter, so you understand, the learning curve. The second method you can cheat in a behavioral interview is to basically prepare to score the max points for the behaviors that they're interested in. And the simplest example here, and a rather niche example, is the Amazon interview, where they screen you on their 14 leadership principles. So if you spot which leadership principle are they interested in, you can score the most points by exploiting the behavior in that leadership principle. It's of course easier said than done, but this is a method that improves your overall performance if used correctly, right? And the third method to cheat in behavioral interviews is to spin your best stories. So if you have watched my previous videos, I said that it's a danger in behavioral interviews to use the same story, because they will confront notes. And if they see that you use the same story, you will be perceived as a candidate without a lot of experience. However, here, if you have 5 best stories and you spin them over to answer any type of question you're thrown at, your answers will always, at least in theory, score the most points. So if they don't spot you that use the same story, then at least in theory, you will score the maximum points. Again, this is a rather advanced technique that not many people use, and not especially for not junior to mid-level roles. But this, in case you're wondering how do people cheat in behavioral interviews. So a couple of pieces of advice when it comes to the actual interview. The first and the most important of them is to listen. If you really listen to what the interviewer is saying, you're a lot more likely to not only understand what they're asking you, but to also understand how your performance evolves over time. More often than not, the candidates that understand, that read the room virtually nowadays, that are also the candidates that actually get jobs. It's as straightforward as this, and I have proof in case you're wondering. The second advice here would be energy. Keep your energy levels at least even, if not on an upwards trend throughout your performance, because it's oftentimes that people actually tend to go downwards towards the end of the interview, or even towards the end of each of their answers. Try to test these things out during your role plays, for example. Next advice, do your best. Always use your best possible story in a job interview, no matter if it's the first interviewing round and no matter with whom you're interviewing with. At the end of the day, they must give you a higher or no higher recommendation. So always use the best possible stories. If you feel like you'll have to spin the stories over and over again, you could ask the second interviewer, hey, I used this story in my previous interview. Is it okay if I use it again, or do you have another question? They usually have a ton of questions to ask you if they really wanted to. So always do your best in a job interview. And last but not least, you could always win time during the actual interview by taking notes. Like, notes are also useful for other purposes, but if you take notes of the question you're getting asked, for example, you also win a couple of seconds, to prepare a better answer, to find an even better story, or just to get back on track if you have to recover from a low during that job interview. But taking notes is also an essential thing you want to keep in mind during the actual job interview. What are some of the steps you can take after the job interview? The first one you could do, especially if you feel comfortable doing, but that's usually good advice, is to send a thank you note. In some places, it's also possible to send some clarifications as to how your performance really went, and if you wanted to add some notes to some examples that you gave during that job interview. The second thing you want to do is to ensure that you take notes, even more notes that you took during the interview, simply because you want to really understand how it went. Like if you get rejected and you don't know why they rejected you, that's the worst possible outcome of a job interview. Next piece of advice is to closely link with the previous one, is you should take this as a journey rather than a destination. If you take this as a destination, that you have an interview, you fail, and then you start from zero, then basically this is the worst path to get good at behavioral interviewing in general. And the other important reason why you want to take this as a journey is because if these employers enforce a behavioral interview to get in, it means they will have a behavioral practice once you're also inside, and they will also likely use you to screen other candidates for those behavioral interviews as well. So journey, not a destination here. Next advice here, in my opinion, unless they give you a reason for your rejection, which many companies do, and something which I actually disagree with, I would advise you not to ask them for a rejection reason. In my experience, they're rarely useful. They're rarely to the point, especially if you ask them for one. I've also done another video giving you more details than the whole reasoning behind this. And last but not least, how long until you can follow up with them if you receive no answer for them? I'd give them at least 3 weeks. At least in my opinion, especially during these times when the interviews are virtual and things are not moving as fast as they used to, or uncertainty is not good for business. So I'd give them at least 3 weeks, also because, if I'd have to negotiate a job offer, it's never a good starting point if you had to continuously follow up with them to see what's going on. So this would be some of the advices that I'd give you for what to do after that job interview.